Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to b5. Pawn a7 to a6. Bishop b5 takes c6. Pawn d7 takes c6. Knight b1 to c3. Bishop c8 to g4. Pawn h2 to h3. Bishop g4 takes f3. Queen d1 takes f3. Knight g8 to f6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to d6. Pawn d2 to d3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to g5. Pawn c6 to c5. Knight c3 to d5. Bishop d6 to e7. Knight d5 takes e7, check. Queen d8 takes e7. Bishop g5 takes f6. Queen e7 takes f6. Queen f3 takes f6. Pawn g7 takes f6. Pawn f2 to f4. King g8 to g7. Pawn g2 to g3. Rook a8 to d8. King g1 to g2. Rook f8 to g8. King g2 to f3. Pawn h7 to h5. Pawn a2 to a4. Pawn a6 to a5. Rook a1 to b1. Rook d8 to d4. Rook b1 to a1. Pawn f6 to f5. Pawn f4 takes e5. Pawn f5 takes e4, check. Pawn d3 takes e4. Rook g8 to d8. Rook f1 to f2. King g7 to g6. Rook a1 to a2. Pawn c5 to c4. Rook a2 to a1. Rook d4 to d2. Rook a1 to f1. Pawn c4 to c3. Pawn b2 takes c3. Pawn h5 to h4. Pawn g3 takes h4. King g6 to g7. Rook f1 to g1, check. King g7 to h6. Rook f2 to g2. King h6 to h5. Pawn c3 to c4. King h5 takes h4. Pawn c2 to c3. Rook d2 to d3, check. King f3 to f4. Rook d3 takes c3. Rook g2 to g7. Rook d8 to d7. Rook g7 to h7, checkmate.